Welcome back to the secrets of writing a research paper. I'm Mr. Ewing, and I cannot imagine life without books. Some of my favorites include The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay, A Tale of Two Cities, and Looking for Alaska. You should check one out sometime. I will use the invention that made all of these books possible in an example that will be part of this lesson: how to explain and elaborate. Please feel free to pause, rewind, or rewatch this video as needed. You can go at your own pace, as always. So here's an example body paragraph that a high school student wrote. We'll use it as an example in this lesson. First, I'll read it aloud as you follow along. The printing press is also the most impactful invention because it revolutionized education. More books were printed in the 50 years after the Gutenberg's invention than scribed in the 1,000 years before. Now, rather than learn primarily from teachers who shared their knowledge in the form of lectures, students could advance their own learning individually by reading printed materials. One can imagine how revolutionary this development was. As long as a person could read and afford a text, his education was no longer dependent on meeting an expert at a specified time and place. Imagine how much more quickly someone could advance their knowledge. In fact, in the period following this invention, students began surpassing the knowledge of their teachers at a rate never before seen. The educational process also changed because the printed materials available gave people more options. They could now learn about topics that interested them rather than the topics teachers lectured on. However, this was not always the case. Gutenberg's invention sometimes had a very negative impact on education. For instance, peoples conquered by European invaders were often forced to learn European languages and customs. Just as the education of European pupils was accelerated thanks to the printing press, one can imagine the destruction of indigenous American and African cultures was also accelerated. Despite this, many believe that education has been more positively impacted by the printing press. Mark Twain, widely regarded as one of the greatest American writers, agreed when he said, "The bad that Gutenberg's colossal invention has brought about is overshadowed 1,000 times by the good with which mankind has been favored." Someone who relied on the printing press so heavily for his education and livelihood would certainly be well aware of its multitudinous impacts. In the end, it is clear that the printing press had an unmatchable impact through its involvement in education around the world. While we're here, let's review topic and conclusion sentences. So first here, we've got a connection to the thesis. The printing press is the most impactful invention. And then we have the focus of the paragraph identified because it revolutionized education. In the conclusion sentence, we have the same thing, just reworded or said a different way. It's clear that the printing press had an unmatchable impact, and a connection to that was the connection to the thesis. And now in Salmon, the focus is wrapped up through its involvement in education around the world. So these are two pretty good topic and conclusion sentences from this author. Now, here's a pro tip. The explanation and elaboration element should link ideas together and clearly connect the evidence presented to your thesis. And to make sure this writer has done that, we'll highlight evidence in one color and explanation in another color, so we can then focus on the explanation or elaboration element. So highlighting the evidence should be pretty easy thanks to the in-text citations. So everything there in blue is evidence. And the rest of it should be explanation or elaboration on how that evidence connects to the thesis. All right, so let's just highlight the explanation here. Now, this bolded part elaborates on the evidence presented in the two sentences that come before it by explaining how the evidence connects to the thesis. In particular, how the evidence connects to the focus of the paragraph. This bolded part here serves as a link between an idea discussed and a contrary idea that follows. This bolded part elaborates upon the evidence presented in the two sentences that come before it by explaining how the evidence connects to the thesis, in particular, how the evidence connects to the focus of the paragraph, and it also serves as a link between an idea just discussed and a contrary idea that follows. This bolded part elaborates upon the evidence presented in the quotation by amplifying the expertise of the individual who is quoted. All right, so your next pro tip is typically the last sentence before your conclusion sentence should be a bit of explanation or elaboration. Following this guideline will help you avoid presenting a new piece of evidence without giving it proper explanation. Okay, now I've gone over all the essential ingredients needed to write a good body paragraph. We've talked about topic and conclusion sentences, presenting evidence, using in-text citations appropriately and correctly, explaining the evidence and elaborating on that evidence, and we also talked about how to select and use quotations effectively. So you've got what you need to write a good body paragraph now. So you should be able to use your knowledge to use this recipe or these directions to put that together. So after completing this lesson, you should now be able to describe the importance of explanation or elaboration in a body paragraph, and you should be able to write effective body paragraphs and then get feedback from your teacher. As always, consult your assignment schedule or check with your teacher to determine exactly what is expected of you next. In the next lesson, I'll show you how to write an introduction paragraph, and after that, how to write a conclusion paragraph.